Hello and welcome to Weird Together. I'm Brennan Storr.
I am Joseph Comeau.
This is the show where we explore the sociology behind your favorite horror films and sometimes your new favorites. We're not critics.
We're not experts.
We're just weird together. Joseph, my friend, welcome back. It's been a while.
It has, as the kids like to say, it's been a minute. Took a little bit of a break over the holidays, took some time to kind of, reset, decompress, and kind of hit the new season of Weird Together with some, fresh motivation and momentum, and maybe a little bit of a kind of a refining of our focus, right, in terms of how we approach the show.
Yeah, exactly. If you have listened to our show for a while or before, you'll notice the opening is a little bit different. And that's because we are refocusing slightly from exploring exclusively newer films, although our focus will always be on helping spread the word about new independent film. But we also will be taking time to look at the sociology of some older films as well. And again, the sociology is more the focus of what we're doing here now, which sounds boring, I know, but trust me, it won't be.
Yeah, and for folks who might not have a lot of background in sociology, really it's social observing, right? It's looking at what's going on in the world around us and kind of taking a peek behind the curtain, right? If you've ever seen the classic film, The Matrix, it's, do you take the red pill or blue pill and everything goes back to what it used to be? Or do you look at things through a different lens? And in sociology, it's like taking that red pill and not in a kind of a crazy...
not in a douchebaggy manosphere way.
Right, which is relevant for the film we're going to be talking today, but we'll get to that. But in a way that you just start to look at the structures behind things and kind of the interests and the ideologies underneath things. And once you've kind of started looking at things that way, you can't watch anything through exactly the same lens you used to. And you're just always looking at these larger themes. So when we talk about the sociology of films, really what we're going to look at is what are the social themes? What are the messages that kind of influence the writing of the films? And what are the commentaries embedded within the films about the world around us? And, did I mention I have a PhD, Brennan?
And boy, glad I was sitting down when I got that.
Yeah. Yeah. But my PhD is in sociology. So we're going to be talking about, things, kind of looking at the world through that lens. And Bren is a very astute social observer. So we've had some really great conversations over the course of this podcast, looking at those things. And, we're looking forward to kind of continuing that focus as we move into this next season.
Yes, sir. And to kick off that new season, we are talking about a really great little independent film called First Time Caller. But before we talk about First Time Caller, we got to do that thing we do on this show, because you never watch a film in a vacuum. Every movie you've ever seen comes into it with you, the day you had, the situation in which you watched it. It all factors into what we like to call the baggage. All right, Joseph, your baggage with this film is going to be much more substantial than mine. So why don't you tell us how you came to find First Time Caller?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one for me because I actually know the producer. He's from the city where I currently reside. He's originally from here. He lives in New York now. But I've had the opportunity to meet him and interact with him socially, a handful of times over the last couple of years. He runs in some similar circles, and when he's in town visiting family and such, been at a couple gatherings with friends and neighbors, and just had conversations with him in the past. He's a really good guy, and I'm sure he'll listen to this. So, hey, Patrick. But yeah, so I knew the producer and then was invited with maybe a couple dozen friends to do a private viewing at a neighbor's house who, with Patrick, and went and watched the film with some friends of mine. So going into it, I knew the producer. So obviously based on just that relationship, I wanted to like it. But what was really great is I actually really, really liked the film. We've reviewed a lot of independent films with limited budgets, and we've seen what can be done well and not well in those situations. And this film stands up very well to other films kind of in its sort of budget range, so to speak. So, for me, certainly I came into it with significant baggage of knowing the producer, really, really enjoyed the film. And I'm not just saying that.
I knew nothing about the film going in. You mentioned that there was some manosphere stuff that we could maybe talk about. You mentioned that, it was about a guy on the radio ostensibly, or, internet radio show And I have a real connection to radio, right? Like I grew up listening to the radio. I grew up in a very small town. So when I was a kid at night, and I'm very much a night person, I couldn't go out. And even if I could, there was nowhere to go. So I would listen to the radio. The radio became my connection to the world. I guess, of course, because I make my living as a podcaster. Now I'm a full-time podcaster. I'm also very aware of some of the things that the film was kind of describing or dealing with. And we'll talk about that more in the Talktagon. But I guess I have much more of a connection to that world than I used to. So those early sort of tendencies towards radio are now kind of combined with my current career, talking to people for money. And I think that all really affected how I saw the film and probably connected me to it more than it might have otherwise. Which again, not to say I don't like the film, because I do, but I think in the end, I went in with more baggage than I had anticipated at the start. And we're going to talk more about what we liked about the film, the handful of things that I didn't, and some of the larger themes that I thought it touched on. And we're going to do that in the only place gentlemen like us can do that, Joseph. That's a Talktagon. Welcome to the Talktagon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave. All right, so first-time caller, the story of internet radio show host Brent Ziff, who discovers the link between constipation and the apocalypse, something I think we all have faced at one point or another, but Brent Ziff faces it in a much more long-term fashion. So, Joseph, let's start by saying what you enjoyed about First-Time Caller.
In general, I thought, again, it was, the acting was solid. I liked the dialogue. I thought it was kind of some witty banter. The story was interesting and different. If you're going to have a film that runs, about 75 minutes, and it's in one room primarily, with one person on camera primarily, and then some voices, like, to pull that off in this setting, you better have good writing. And I thought the film had some really nice writing and creativity. So I liked all of those things about it. It looked good. I think there were some interesting, kind of cool, creative things visually, in terms of where they use sort of the kind of the EQ kind of graphics at points were edited in sort of a stylized way. You know, the EQ from
the waveforms.
Waveforms. There you go. Thank you. I knew that Mr. Podcaster here would know the technical term for this. So the waveforms as a visual element, I thought was a nice little touch, especially with a film with a limited budget, to find creative things like that you can, kind of insert into the film that give it sort of a feel, was kind of nice. So a lot of things like that I liked, but obviously, we focused on the themes, and I thought all the things, Manosphere and then Podcaster, were really interesting to me in this.
Yeah, I felt the same way. I was very impressed by what they managed to pull off with I have to imagine was a small crew and a probably even smaller cast. And once the sort of the hook of the film begins, the fact we're learning about the fact that there's sort of this absurdist way of finding out the world is ending. This guy who feels the contractions of the earth in his colon. I actually, by that point, was so invested and that I felt the claustrophobia of what that moment would be like, to find out that the thing you've always been afraid of, that's here now. And that feeling was it came through very well. And maybe because that's a thing I obsess about, but it really landed with me, and I got chills, especially when Shorty says things like, well, it's not going to stop, because we all do that thing, right? Like Brent only just got famous, as he puts it. So he's still kind of in that place where he's got the very scrappy mentality where he thinks he has to take on everyone. And as you know, I mean, when you reach a certain point of, I hate the word internet fame, but like notoriety, I guess, you can't fight everyone anymore. You can't, because it will destroy you. It will sink you. Like you cannot possibly deal with all the critics one-to-one, right? Like that's not something you can do. But obviously he's kind of, fame happened to him, as he says, it sort of blew up. I don't think he ever really explains how he blew up, but he did. And now he's got to contend with this, and that can happen, right? I mean, especially with the world of podcasting, not a problem for me, but you can have that sort of meteoric rise, and if you're not ready to handle it, it's like getting rich suddenly. Like there are studies showing that people who get rich suddenly, it almost like it short circuits their brain. People who win the lottery and then go broke, that's not an uncommon story, because people who've never had money to suddenly have it, you don't know what to do with it. And I think it's the same thing with fame. I think that's, again, like guys like Brent, they are still trying to fight the same battles that they fought when they were little guys at a level where you're doing it full time. And again, that's something that will, even without the apocalypse, it'll drive you nuts. So I think while the apocalypse kind of put up a permanent worldwide, that you're not going to have as much time as you think. But I think for Brent, it very likely would have been the same thing, because even with I think for guys like him, the apocalypse is always going to come, because unless you're prepared for it, you're going to hit the wall sooner than you think you will.
No, I think, and this kind of, I want to kind of connect this to kind of one of the things I mentioned that was interesting to me. Some of the sort of the behind the scenes aspects of podcasting / radio / content creation. And it's a little bit related to what you talked about, like, not that I've experienced any kind of measurable fame, so to speak, by any stretch. I have a nice little community that likes the stuff I do, in my football stuff. But it's a very, small but really wonderful community. But there's still these themes, and we've kind of talked about the asymmetrical relationship between a content creator, radio host, and the listeners, and then also sort of this weirdly anomic nature of that space. And I think that kind of connects a little bit with what you're talking about, because you have this guy Brent Ziff who kind of takes this sort of very irreverent approach and kind of this manosphere kind of archetype, and has this success. But you would think when you're successful, what space do you have to be jaded because now it's working? But he still has this me against the world mentality you talked about. And there's just so much psychology / social psychology behind that. Like, on one level, like, as humans, I believe that relationships are profoundly important to our mental health and our sense of self. There's some really great theories about that. I've maybe referenced one of my favorites, the Looking Glass Self. It's Cooley's Looking Glass Self, and it's epitomized in this really simple but kind of paradoxical saying that's I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. And it's sort of this, and I'll give you a second. I don't know, it's like a thing to process. I am who I think you think I am, which is sort of this reflexive sort of thing where our identities are constructed based on we interact with people, and then we interpret their feedback, what we think they're thinking of us, by things they say and do. And we don't know what they're thinking for sure, right? So it's this weird kind of interaction with others, this dialectical thing where we create our identity. So there's all that psychology of that, and relationships are really important to that, right? To have people that you know well but still like you is really profoundly positive. But when you're in a space like this, there's all these asymmetrical, quote unquote, relationships, with listeners who have on their own various degrees of their own healthy orientation towards others or lack thereof sometimes. And you will absolutely have some people who will be part of your community who want to be acknowledged or affirmed and want to see you as someone they have a bigger connection with than the reality of the connection, right? They listen to you and they get to know you. In their mind, you're their friend, right? And they know you. And the tough part about that is, unless I, as the content creator or podcast or whatever, has spent time with you, I don't know you the way you feel like you know me, right? So it creates an asymmetry. So psychologically, if they're not really vividly aware of this dynamic, they start to feel this greater relationship and connection, and then expectation of what that relationship is than what is actually there. And then so you have these people calling in who are seeking affirmation of that relationship they've constructed in their head. There's a number of ways you can respond to that. You can be gracious and, say, hey, in your own mind as a content creator, say, I understand this dynamic and I'm going to be kind to this person, but I also understand there's boundaries that need to be there just for everyone's good. Or you can be like Brent and just kind of tee off on it. And so he takes advantage of that to the entertainment of the other viewers, and in a very much like an unhealthy kind of relationship, some of those people keep coming back for that affirmation, hoping that they'll get just a nugget of compliment. So there's these weird, interesting asymmetries that, again, you and I have talked about this stuff off air in the past that I'm sure are very much related to kind of your experience, but there's also the loneliness of that, because you do have all these recurring communications with people that gives the feeling to our human brains of social interaction. but it lacks the organic depth and breadth of the kinds of interactions that you actually have in a real relationship, right? So you're talking to people and hearing them, and even if they're calling in or you're reading their emails or talking to them, there's still the lack of depth of that relationship. So it gives your brain the feeling of like you're having an interaction, but it lacks depth, so there's emptiness there. I know there's a lot I just unpacked there. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on that. But that whole kind of aspect of the podcaster space, I thought was really kind of nicely illustrated in this film.
I agree. Interestingly, and I won't get into the specifics of it, but there is a connection between, as you and I discussed off air, between this film and my favorite podcast. There is sort of a tenuous connection between these two things, which I did not realize until we spoke prior to the show. But what was interesting is when that show last year went through a major disruption in its community, and again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of it. It's all public record shit. It's just not my business. But I learned the term parasocial relationship. That's that asymmetrical relationship where one person feels they know the other party very, very well. And audio is a very intimate medium. There is something about, the voices in your ears, you feel like you're part of something, especially if the person's good at doing what they're doing. You feel like a part of that conversation. And it can be tough because it comes with a lot of expectation on the part of the person listening. I think when you've got a creator like Brent who needs approval, he might try to posture that he doesn't, but ultimately he does. And that sets up this really terrible dynamic because quite often people who need that approval can't accept love. They need love, but what they need, they actually can't receive because they have issues around that. Like they are suspicious of affirmation, but at the same time they require affirmation. And I think it sets up in them this real kind of hatred of the people who love you. And I think that's how people like this tend to end up emotionally abusing the ones closest to them because they have a difficult time accepting that love. And I think for Brent, because he needs this, and I think you see this with a lot of people, it's reflected in how they treat their audience. If you went from no one to someone very quickly, there's no, like I said before, there's no training. There's no suite of instructions on how to now behave. And eventually when you get to the top, you're not equipped to deal with all the attention, right? Because say if you're a comedian, you're used to dealing with crowds. You got a guy in an audience, he heckles you. Okay, well, it's like 10 people in the club. We're going to fuck with that guy because, it's useful. But at some point, fighting those battles stops being useful and just starts hurting you. But again, like with Brent, he hasn't reached that point. Like this was something I struggled with when we first started the Ghost Story guys, because we're not anywhere near the popularity of the character of Brent Ziff or even my favorite podcast. We're nowhere near that. But again, it's enough I can make a living doing it. When I first started, I didn't recognize this in me, but I needed the audience. I needed that attention. And I came to sort of identify some of the people, like my frequent contributors, as almost as friends. People who I would chat with on Messenger or Instagram, like people who listen to the show. It was just, we would have these sort of chats and I kind of came to consider these real relationships because I was, at that point in my life, I was very much starved for human contact. I'd worked in an office job for 7 years by myself. Like 6-7 years working alone, they'll fuck with you. But the lesson I learned after I fired my first co-host was that these people are not your friends. And to be clear, I have listeners who have been listening from the beginning, and we have a good, solid relationship. I wouldn't say some of them I actually am friends with now. And I've met them in real life, and we've met multiple times, and there's a connection there. But I learned that just because someone pays attention to you, to what you're creating, there's not a bond there. It is very much a one-sided parasocial relationship. And it was kind of damaging when those people turned on me, because I fired and I had good reasons to do it. And I'm not going to get into it. This is all years old now, but they were not privy to that because we only ever presented a certain side of our relationship to the public. Thankfully, I was not 100% needing all that attention because I was able to kind of steer out of it, and it taught me to develop healthier habits. But I know people who are much more successful than I am who really struggle with that boundary, who still are kind of, it's like touching the oven, even though it hurts you. Is it still hot? Yep, still hot. Like I still need that approval. Oh, but they still hate me. And it sets up this weird tension that, again, if you're not careful, you end up like Brent, where you started out angry, which is the fire that gave you the ability to get where you got. But then you can't harness that anger. You can't transmute it into something that's long-term. You just stay angry. And again, you can only go so long as the bear everyone's having a laugh at poking before it just drives you crazy. Or you end up like Bob Berg, the Denver radio show host who was shot in his driveway by white supremacists in, I want to say, 1984. He just loved provoking these guys. He just loved pushing those buttons. He loved messing with these people. Would not listen. He was an angry dude, would not listen, kept pushing, and eventually they pushed back. And I think that, eventually something, if you're not careful, if you don't harness that, something pushes back.
And it's interesting, kind of pivoting this back to the film itself. He uses his audience as a resource, right? Whereas, for us, they're part of the community and that we do care about, and that we appreciate that they actually want to take the time to listen to what we do. For him, they are part of the show, but they are part of the show in that, for example, the caller Brainiac who calls in, right? Who obviously he has a nickname, he knows him, and he's called in frequently, kind of knows what to expect from him, a very manosphere kind of, textbook sort of whatever. And he lets him go off a little bit, and then he bashes him. But this isn't his first time calling, you can tell. So you can tell that Brainiac seeks that affirmation that I talked about so much, that acknowledgement, that he'll call in hoping that just maybe this is the time I say the thing that Brent loves and he invites me to be his permanent co-host, right? That's the thing he's looking for. And Brent knows that his audience wants that affirmation. So he'll string him along and just boom. And then, and it's really in many ways an emotionally kind of manipulative, abusive sort of arrangement he has with this audience that is falling for it, right? And it certainly speaks to the potentials of the dark side of that, having an audience, that you can care about your audience like you do, or you can manipulate them as this character does in this sort of manosphere space.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that at the end of the film, and of course, folks, if you're listening for the first time, we spoil the shit out of these things. At the end of the film, I mean, Brent gets something I think he both wants, but also can't handle, where he's all of a sudden got these people swearing their loyalty to him. And that's a little bit like a dog catching the car, right? Because they see him as a figure of strength. And I think that's one of the ironic things about where we're at right now. I mean, I don't think this is actually all that new, but people perceive strength through certain displays of it. But quite often the people who are intent on making those really overt displays of strength are not that strong. It is in fact why they have to make these displays, so they feel secure. And I think it's an interesting comment that once Brent gets the thing he wants, he's the man. Not only is he famous, he's the guy. And all of a sudden people will, because they think, him and Shorty will guide them through this new world, all of a sudden, like, they're willing to swear total fealty to him. And he can't handle it. So I think that's true of so many people doing this kind of work. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, you're not the person you portray yourself as, but now you have to answer for that image you've created. And again, that was something I kind of faced early on. When I first started, I kind of felt I had to portray myself as very wacky and outre and very like ribald. And I mean, I'm, as you know, I like dirty jokes and all that shit. And I'm the person I am. I'm a weird guy, but I wasn't the guy I pretended to be. But people started reacting to me like I was. And I really didn't like that. I didn't like the way they treated that guy. And so I thought, okay, this is stupid. I'm going to be me. Me is infinitely weirder. I'm very likely on the spectrum. I'm very strange, but allowing myself to be me has meant when people react to me, I'm more comfortable with that reaction. Because again, they're not necessarily, they don't know me, but I'm at least they're reacting to things I say and I'm honest about. Whereas when I was being goofy, I didn't necessarily believe the things I was saying, but it was for a laugh. And so again, I'm more comfortable if people come to me and respond to me based on what I put out there. But if you're Brent, when deep down inside you're lonely and you're scared, and all of a sudden people are coming to you looking for guidance, that must be terrifying.
Yeah, I think this is a great segue into that whole kind of manosphere ethos or pathos, really. You and I were off air, we're talking within a different context. And I mentioned there's a difference between confidence and bravado. And confidence is often very calm and still and subtle, real confidence. But people, through kind of really flawed representations of what that is that are exaggerated in film and media think that confidence is these big shows that you talked about, these kind of forced bravado. And there's a lot of that in what Brent's doing in this manosphere. And you can tell, just from his viewers and the way they seek affirmation, and they talk about being alphas and sigmas, and the Brainiac talking about the textbook bullet points of a beta. But here he is seeking the approval of a shock jock, essentially, kind of manosphere dude. And all these people calling in, trying to act like quote unquote alphas. And in the end, they all want their mommy, right? Literally in the film, they wanted their mommy, right? And not to in any way dismiss the, mother-son relationship. It's an important relationship, but it's ironic that in that space that, the desire to want your mommy, so to speak, would certainly be something they would lampoon, right? But then in the end, all these lonely men primarily, right, who have these unfulfilled lives and are trying to compensate with this false bravado, in the end, when shit hits the fan, they want their mommy, right? It's so ironic.
I think it's interesting that we're in this place now where, populism is having the moment it is, right? I was thinking about this in Canada. The person leading our Conservative Party is a guy named Pierre Poilievre. And I think he's a joke. He's a clown. He's not a capable leader. He's not a serious person. I don't think he's anywhere near as intelligent as he thinks he is. And I say this because this is someone who said that crypto is the future of Canada's fucking currency. This is a guy who said this is, crypto is how we beat inflation. And obviously, I want to say like a month later, the crypto market collapsed. So this guy he's not a serious person, but he is very possibly going to be our next prime minister. And I know reasonably intelligent people who are successful in business who say, no, this guy's our guy because he speaks with strength. Okay, his policies are a horror show. What the few policies he's put forward that aren't just, boo, that guy sucks, pointing at our current leader. That's all he's got. But they're like, no, but he says it with strength. And we have no ability to evaluate these things anymore, aside from like these sort of peacock displays. But I guarantee you, when we're in a crisis situation, he's not going to be able to function. Just like these guys with Brent. Again, they all want to be that guy. They have this idea like this is the alpha male. I'm the decision maker. I'm the decider. But like my friends who aren't getting laid, who think that they're going to have sex with a woman 15 times in a night, boy, so she better come ready. It's like, no, man, you just spend all your time in your head. These guys are just living in an alternate world. Guys like Andrew Tate, guys like Jordan Peterson. Like Peterson actually is a grifter. I wouldn't include Jordan Peterson in this. Andrew Tate's a grifter too, but I think Andrew Tate genuinely believes his shit. Whereas I'm not convinced Jordan Peterson does. I think Jordan Peterson's just riding a train.
I think Jordan Peterson is actually intelligent, but I don't align with many things he says. But I think he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, he's not. That's what I mean. He's not a stupid man. He's just he's grifting. He's grifting. Because again, in the beginning, that dude had a couple things to say that, yeah, sure, fine, clean your room. All right, yeah. Well, this is also shit my grandmother used to tell me. But okay, fine. I see the value in that. But he's since progressed completely outside his realm of expertise. But I think you're right. I think in the end, it's all built on nothing. But what scares me, man, is that we're building so many of our structures on top of that foundation of nothing. I think because everyone is scared. So they're all looking for an adult in the room. But as it turns out, it's just toddlers in trench coats all the way down.
And so much of that does sadly kind of build on the insecurities, to be quite honest, of males with stunted emotional and relational development, right? They lack authentic relationships. They feel like something is missing and something is missing. And as humans, we want connection intellectually, emotionally, and physically, right? And many of these men lack in all three of those. And they don't have experience understanding what authentic, emotionally connected relationships are. And because they're emotionally stunted, they think, okay, well, I just need to find a physically gratifying relationship. And how do I do that? Oh, then there's a guy like Andrew Tate out there who is selling a bill of goods of how you do that by being a whatever alpha male or whatever bullshit, and sells that, oh, see, this works for me or whatever. And men who lack the emotional acumen and maturity fall into that, and then they become further angry because it's not working for them. Then it feeds into that really problematic, sort of cycle, that feedback loop, that potentially if their mental health is bad enough and they're sort of lacking in kind of inhibitions, then we have dangerous things that happen. It's a very dangerous space, and the people who are making money off of that, they kind of deny responsibility for that. They kind of say, well, listen, I'm not telling people to do this, and it's, but they're invested because they're making a shit ton of money, and they'll keep doing that. So it's really problematic. If I have one sliver of hope in all of this, it's that humans, we do sort of recalibrate. We try to right course, right? If something's lacking in our lives, we try to fix it. Now, we don't always do it right. We often do it in a way that, like I just described. But this lack of real community, I think there's a pushback potentially where maybe, hopefully, people will start to recognize that the virtual spaces and the digital world we live in don't fulfill that, and we need authentic relationships. And to draw a parallel, kind of in the industrial kind of modernist society of Taylorism in the 20th century, you had this kind of this push towards efficiency and calculability and like as epitomized by the McDonald's hamburger and the TV dinner. Efficient, cheap, mass-produced, quick. And it's all these things that in that era, that Taylorism era, are efficient and great. And like, oh, this is the future. We can feed everyone and create food that's cheap and affordable. And then we come to realize, yeah, that McDonald's hamburger is nice in a pinch, and that microwave dinner is nice, but people now are long for farm to table, locally grown, authentic, healthy, right? There becomes this pendulum shift where when we have something societally that's pushed by technology, which was what all those food options I described were pushed by technology and mass production, that has certain efficiencies that at a macro level are tantalizing, they become dehumanizing. And as humans, we push back and we long for something better, more authentic. So my hope is that this world we described of virtual communities that are lacking, that we as humans who want that connection will increase. And I do think you see some of this, but push for more authentic communities and connections because we feel something missing. Not everyone's going to have the emotional bandwidth or maturity to get that. But my hope is if enough people recognize that and push for that, it becomes a social movement, the wave of that, the rising tide lifts all ships in the harbor kind of thing, maybe we start to create more widespread initiative and effort and focus on those kinds of spaces and community as a societal kind of recalibration and fix. So that's, I hope, what happens.
Me too, man. And to take that back to first time caller, when Shorty is describing what he anticipates society will be after the crash, I think he is really describing, what he's describing is essentially the society we're talking about, a society where we have to connect with one another. But what's interesting is how he describes it is it's almost like a nightmare, because we've become so separated from this notion of community that to him, if we're losing the technology, barbarity or anarchy is the only thing that's waiting for us. But again, I think that's just something the film is very astute about in illustrating how far we've come from these structures. We can't conceive of a world without technology that isn't Mad Max, because that is what has been fed us, because that is, it's a more interesting narrative. But in actual fact, what we've seen when when technology collapses, people tend to look after each other. Yeah, sure, there is nightmarish shit, and it happens and it's unavoidable. But I mean, I always think about the field hospitals that sprung up on freeway overpasses during Hurricane Katrina. That those were people who just started looking after each other. And yeah, there was absolutely horrible things that happened during that and other catastrophes. But the prevailing story is that people will take care of one. And what I think is interesting is Brent starts arguing with Shorty about what he thinks is going to happen. And again, I think it's a very clever way of doing it. It shows that Brent is not the thing he is portraying out there. He is not who his audience are or who his audience truly think he is. And this is a little bit of that chaos thing, right? Be careful what you put out there, because people will react to you based on what you put out there. And Brett puts out there that he's this, dick, and he's this cruel guy, and he's, manly man, he take no prisoners, alpha male, all that nonsense. So they respond to him in that way because he came up fast. He doesn't have the safeguards in place. he's not prepared to cope with what's going to come back at him. I think the film is very subtle in how it does these things, but I think it really has thought it through. And I think it really is an intelligent examination of these dynamics.
Yeah, and I think there's some nice subtlety to the way, and it seems like the wrong word for Brent Ziff here, but there is some subtlety to how his character is developed, because there would be this temptation to write him as this ultra right wing, total, across the board, whatever, but here he is kind of making fun of that Freedom Fest or whatever concert, right? And when someone comes at him with the anti-Semitism stuff, instead of kind of leaning into that, he kind of makes this joke about, well, if that's, Jewish people really run the world, why did I not get the memo, kind of a thing, right? Why wasn't I not invited? And all these little subtle things that position him as someone who's certainly manosphere and certainly problematic, but they don't pull him through every trope, every potential cliche part of that constellation. Right. So I think there's some interesting nuance where they make him maybe a little more realistic and believable, because for example, a really huge podcaster whose name I won't name, who we both know of, who, maybe we're not fans of, also has some nuance in his views. Right. And has maybe a certain percent of things he says that I'm like, yeah, I agree with that. Right. And so there was at least sufficient nuance in Brent Ziff's character to avoid him being too much of a caricature.
Yeah, and I think there are people out there like Brent. There are people who maybe they don't necessarily fall into one, political ideology. I mean, I don't even like phrasing it that way, because I think politics has invaded every fucking aspect of our waking lives. But, they don't necessarily fall into one single ideology, but they're smart enough to know how to play both sides. I think the dangerous thing about that is that quite often those people are not as clever as they think they are. And again, they don't necessarily realize what it means to ride those lines. Like one of the examples I use all the time is, I've known people who were adjacent to the criminal world. I mean, I myself have been adjacent to the criminal world, but I've been smart enough to stay away from it. But I know people who sort of like flirting around with that world because they like what it gets them. They like the validation of being, the guy who's right on the edge of it. But those worlds will swallow you. And I think, again, that's deftly portrayed here, where Brent is a guy, this isn't really truly what he believes. This is just, it's a good gag, it's good money, and he's just, he's that guy. He's South Park. He's taking shots at both sides. But the people who are going to claim you are going to be the worst ones. And so you play with these things, and they're funny until they're not. And again, I think what Brett finds out is, though the film, obviously it's a horror film, his finding out is the apocalypse. I think, again, at some point or another, he was going to find out. At some point, whether it was because of the apocalypse or just because of what he does, I think Shorty was always going to end up at his door. Well, Joseph, just as Shorty was always going to end up at Brent's door, we were always going to hit the end of the episode without having covered everything we wanted to cover. But I that's one of the beautiful things about this show is sometimes you'll start talking about something and it leads to something completely different. But I think we've covered a lot of bases around First Time Caller. But I think just before we head out, we should really compliment the performance by lead Abe Goldfarb, who's also co-director of the project. It's not an easy thing to, as I understand it, to have to carry an entire film on your shoulders. But he does. I think he really effectively portrays not only who Brent is presenting to be, but who he really is. And again, hats off to Abe. That could not have been easy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he does a fantastic job with this character. It's interesting, it's engaging, and then also doing that while directing is certainly an admirable accomplishment. So absolutely, my hat's off as well.
Yeah, and kudos similarly to, again, the rest of the voice actors, the crew. They've pulled off something really, really impressive here. And I think it just works. We sometimes like to say you got to make allowances for X or Y in these films because performance sometimes performance isn't great in independent film, but I don't think you have to make excuses for this. Again, there are a couple seams. What you described with the waveform thing, I actually found distracting and I didn't enjoy it, but even so, it doesn't take you out of the film. Not only is it a really effective apocalyptic chamber piece, I think it's actually better than other similarly themed films at higher budgets. There was a film that came out in 2022 called Night's End that was, I think it was, as I recall, it was a screen film. So everything was kind of happening on a screen. But even so, similar idea. It was a guy who was creating YouTube videos about the haunting in his apartment. And it goes in an apocalyptic direction. And they didn't have a ton of money, but I guarantee they had more money than First Time Caller. And First Time Caller is by far the stronger film.
Yeah, and I kind of mentioned this earlier. I think so much of that is when you have the budget limitations and you're going to do something in one space. If you're going to pull that off, you better have a good concept and good writing. And if not, it's just not going to work. And clearly, it was original. Even if you want to make jokes, about the constipation jokes, but it was a really original idea, and it was interesting, and there was a rationale to it, and the dialogue really pulled it off. And I have watched movies with more action that did not do as good of a job of holding my attention as this film, and that speaks to the writing.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's a big recommend from both of us. Check out First Time Caller. I don't think it is available in Canada currently, but I know you can rent it on Amazon in the US. And I believe it was producer Patrick Terry told you that it will be available internationally in time.
Yes.
It's just it hasn't happened yet.
He indicated that is on the horizons. I was able to watch it on Prime Video. You can get it in the US on Prime Video.
Right. Yeah. So not here in Canada yet, but it is coming. So like I said, that's First Time Caller. Check it out. Joseph, my friend, it's good to be back.
It is. It's been too long, but I'm looking forward to this next season of We're Together and getting into some more films.
So, folks, going forward, we are going to have sort of an irregular release schedule. We found last year that the every 2 weeks thing just didn't really work for us. So while there will be more Weird Together, they will sort of come as we find films we want to talk about, as opposed to any kind of regularity. But you can always find us everywhere on the internet. Joseph, where can folks find you?
You can find me on Twitter at JoComeau13, JoKomo13. And you can find me on YouTube at The Sociology Professor. I do a couple other things, NFL football with the Cardinal rule, but I'm really kind of working on leaning into the sociology side. So if you haven't checked it out already, a YouTube channel called The Sociology Professor with videos explaining different theories and concepts. It's good for people who are trying to study sociology, but it's also, I think, if you're just interested in this, kind of social observation and the kind of stuff we do here, I think you'll kind of enjoy learning about some of the different theories and concepts that I teach about.
You can find me as Largely the Truth on Letterboxd, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. And you can find my other show, The Ghost Story Guys, available everywhere. Find podcasts live. Our theme song is Rest in Peace by The Revenants from their album Music from Big Beige. All other music on this show is also composed and performed by The Revenants and used with permission of Night Harvest Recordings. Well, folks, thanks for joining us. As always, it is our privilege to be in your ears, and we hope you enjoyed the show. And until next time, remember, we're weird.
And you're weird.
So why not be weird together?
Let me